better software. She's also heavily involved in professional organizations, including as the Vice President, President-elect of NASIG. Kristen brings much expertise to today's topic, and we're fortunate to have her with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Kristen, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now we'll turn it over to Kristen. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks for that great introduction. And thank you to everyone who is here today to learn more about KBART and transfer for working with serials. I'll start off by just talking a little bit about what I'm going to cover in the presentation today. So we've got two topics, KBART and transfer, and I'm going to kind of almost treat this as two mini webinars within the larger webinar. So I'll start off talking about KBART, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard itself, its purpose and background, and some of the specific features that are part of the standard. And then I'll talk a little bit about KBART in practice, so some of the things that I've seen people doing using KBART and knowledge-based data that I think are particularly interesting trends for the field. And then I'll pause and we can do 5 minutes of Q&A specifically about KBART. And then I'll pick back up and we'll kind of repeat the process for transfer. So I'll kind of use the same divisions of the presentation, and then we can have a little bit more Q&A at the end. And just so people are prepared for this, I'll probably be spending about 25 minutes on KBART and about 15 minutes on transfer. So it's not totally even division, but I will get to both. I also wanted to share a little bit about myself before we jump into this. The introduction gave a lot of these details, and you can see a lot of the things that Erin mentioned are here on this slide. But I do have a long history of working with serials. I worked with serials and e-resources at NC State for 11 years. And that included a lot of work with GoKB, the Global Open Knowledge Base, of which KBART was a big part. I also served on the KBART Standing Committee for several years. And during that time, I published a library technology report called The Knowledge Base at the Center of the Universe. That is a much more detailed look at knowledge bases and their role in libraries and trends and all that. So that's a good resource if this is a topic of interest to you. And then in terms of my current life at Index Data, we're a small software development company. So my role is a lot broader, but all of my background has definitely served me really well there as I work on Folio, which is a new open source library services platform, and then also Reshare, which is an even newer project to build an open source resource sharing platform. So that's just a little bit about where I'm coming from and the way that that kind of feeds into this background. So throughout the presentation, I will be drawing on examples, particularly from my work at NC State and with some of those projects, but I'll talk a little bit about Folio as well. And before I start to, this is just a quick acknowledgement that some of the slides in this presentation related to KBART come from a presentation called A Deep Dive into KBART. That was a NASIG pre-conference a few years ago. And there's a link to that here. If people want detailed information about KBART, that's actually a great starting point as well. Okay, so I'll start off with KBART, and I want to start off by talking a little bit about the purpose and background of the KBART recommended practice. So KBART stands for Knowledge Bases and Related Tools, and it's a NISO recommended practice that addresses both the way that knowledge-based data is structured and the way that it's delivered across the supply chain. And I'm guessing that in this audience, people are probably pretty familiar with knowledge bases, but just to be clear, talking about e-resources knowledge bases, which tend to be basically like a big database of all the e-journals and e-books and sometimes other types of resources that are being sold in the academic publishing marketplace. And it's a place where you can go and record the localized version of your library's holdings out of everything that's out there. And then that knowledge base powers a lot of other services. So things like OpenURL link resolver, which I'll talk a little bit about, things like discovery tools like Summon or Primo Central or EDS. So knowledge bases have really become pretty core to libraries, you know, in the e-resources era. And so that's why the KBART standard is really something that's so important. KBART has had a long history. It's been around since 2007 when the UKSG working group first formed, and then it was taken over by NISO in 2014, became a NISO standing committee and recommended practice. And KBART is really still going strong. There's a lot of activity around it, and particularly the KBART automation working group, which launched in 2017, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. So I mentioned KBART kind of got its start back in 2007, and it was really tied to the publication of a report called Link Resolvers and the Serial Supply Chain, written by James Culling. And that was kind of a seminal report that really cataloged a lot of the difficulties in collecting knowledge-based data accurately, and really made it clear just how important this data and these tools were becoming to libraries, and kind of spurred the action to form the initial KBART working group. And that group's goal was to develop a recommended practice to help make sure that data was accurate and up to date in knowledge bases and link resolver products. There was an initial phase of development for KBART that was completed in 2010 that was focused mainly on serials. And then in 2014, KBART was expanded to include ebook metadata and also some information about open access status and consortial metadata. So I think really what this kind of boils down to of why is KBART needed is that KBART is both a data standard and a delivery standard. And when you put those two things together, you have good metadata, you're getting that metadata where it needs to go at the right time. And that really can lead to improved access to e-resources, which is what we all want. So I'll talk a little bit now about KBART itself and what the standard actually does and what its features are and how it helps to promote that good metadata. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the KBART ecosystem, or as we say sometimes, the knowledge-based supply chain. And this starts off with the content provider. And so the content provider is often a publisher, but it may also be a vendor who is an aggregator. So it's really anybody who is making available content for libraries, and that may be through sales, so a commercial company that's selling things, or a society, and it can also be open access content. So there's a lot of times where I'll sort of make the assumption that you're going to be paying for this content, which you often are, but it can include free content as well. And essentially, as a content provider, you know, you have these titles and packages of titles that you are making available to your customers, and your customers are going to be relying on knowledge bases and related products to get their users access to those things. So content providers really should be incentivized to make sure that the knowledge-based providers know what they publish, they know what's available for sale or for access, and then so that part of the supply chain is basically creating a file, hopefully a KBART file that represents the content that the content provider sells or makes available, and then that flows along to the knowledge base vendor. the knowledge base vendor, in a way, that's also a little bit of a misnomer in that no one really sells just a knowledge base. So the knowledge base itself is kind of just data. It's just a big database of, hopefully almost every product that as a library you can purchase or make available to your users. What these vendors are really selling are the services that go with a knowledge base, like link resolvers and discovery tools. But the knowledge base is a really key part of those tools and of making them work. So the knowledge base vendor's role in the supply chain is to get the KBART files that the content provider is producing, to harvest those in some way and ingest them into the knowledge base. And that's probably easier said than done because there are a lot of content providers. There's a lot of data munging and things that need to be done with the files. But the goal of KBART is that if everyone is producing the files that look the same and are made available in an easy way, that makes the job of the knowledge base vendor a lot easier and hopefully results in better quality data. And then lastly in the supply chain, we have the library, who is a consumer of the knowledge base and the related tools, and who uses those tools to direct users to content. And I put sometimes for other purposes as well, because I think we're seeing a lot more libraries who are starting to use KBART and knowledge base data for different purposes. So I think e-resources management is a big one, but that's just really useful data. And I think people are starting to see that they can use that for things beyond discovery. And the library, even though it's kind of the end of the supply chain, it doesn't mean that the library doesn't have a role in interacting with the other members of the chain. I think libraries can play a big role in terms of reporting errors, advocating for content providers to use KBART, working with vendors if they are noticing problems. If you're a library and you notice, a big problem with a certain vendor's data and you report that, then that can actually benefit all the users of the knowledge base and really the whole supply chain. So I think it really does kind of come full circle. I did want to briefly address OpenURL and how that fits into all of this. This webinar is not going to really get that deeply into OpenURL. I see that it's definitely related to KBART, but it's more of a component of the link resolver side of things. So it's going to be a little bit out of scope today. But just so that we have the context of what OpenURL is, because that question comes up a lot. OpenURL is basically just a way of taking information that's in a citation that you might find in a database and generating an OpenURL or a URL that contains all of the important data elements of that citation. And then that URL is then passed to a link resolver tool, which compares the citation against an individual library's holdings that they have set in their knowledge base. And so if it finds a match, then it can say, okay, I know the user wants this particular article. I can see that the library subscribes to this journal through an EBSCOhost database, and I have the correct volume and issue that contains the citation. So I'm going to put those two things together and direct the user to the content that they need, and I will, feel pretty confident that they'll actually be able to access it once they get there. And so I guess the value in thinking about this process is you can actually really see how it could break down if you don't have good knowledge base metadata, because if your knowledge base thinks that you have access to something that you really don't have access to, it's going to start sending your users to content that they're not going to be able to get into, and nobody wants that. And then the reverse, of course, would just be that there might be things that users could be getting to that they don't know about because it's not recorded in the knowledge base. So in that kind of classic discovery context, it really is a super important element of the KBART is an important element of kind of the broader OpenURL use case. I'll just kind of briefly show the actual data standard that's part of KBART. So these are really, should actually just be one big spreadsheet, but it's broken down here just so that it can fit onto a single slide. So KBART, I mean, it really, in its most basic, is a set of fields that you can use to describe a resource that would be in a knowledge base. So it's a lot of the core things that you might expect, a title, identifier, URLs so that people can access it. And then there's certain kind of note type things, like if it's monograph versus serial, you might have a general note. Coverage, if it's full text, you can actually do KBART files for things that are just abstracts, although that's very rare. You can code an access type. F is free, so you can do free versus paid. So this all this together helps work with that OpenURL, and it also just gives you a nice snapshot of like a package that a vendor is selling and exactly what's in there. You'll also notice that some of these fields are blank, and that's because KBART accommodates both monographs and serials. So in this case, this is actually an example from a monograph. So all the serial fields are blank, which are kind of the volumes and issues and coverage dates. If this were a serial, some of the other fields would be blank, like the author and editor and date first published, because that's more for a monographic resource. So it's all kind of pulled into one set of fields. And then the KBART delivery standard, this is really probably of most concern to content providers, but it basically makes sure that people who are attempting to be KBART compliant are making their files easily available and on a good schedule. So the standard basically specifies that content providers should make things available either on a web page or via an FTP site. Monthly is the recommended frequency, although it can vary based on how often changes actually occur. And I've actually seen a few publishers lately who are doing changes, I think like hourly, because it's just so much easier to update things these days. And so they're just kind of probably feeding off some of their internal systems and almost just updating as it happens. And then KBART also has a file naming convention that helps the knowledge base vendors know who is this file from, exactly what is in it, is it a package, what is that package called, is it apply only to a particular region or consortium, and then a date. So it's just helping to identify what we're actually talking about. Another element of KBART is the KBART Registry, and this is a website where you can go and you can see entries for all the different publishers that use KBART, and they provide information about their KBART files and how they can be accessed. So, you know, this is a good place if you are a knowledge-based vendor. You probably rely on this pretty heavily because you're needing to know all of these URLs, where the metadata lives, where you can go and harvest it, and who you can get in touch with if you're having a problem. But the KBART registry actually can be really useful if you're a librarian as well. Sometimes it's just a good place to go if you're just trying to see, like, I bought this JSTOR package and I want to know exactly what's supposed to be in there. You can actually go and just download the title list. So it's a nice general resource. I'll talk a little bit about the KBART automation group, which is really the newest element of KBART. And this formed in 2017. And essentially, this is an attempt to standardize a practice that a couple publishers were already doing and that there was a lot of interest in. And basically, the automation element is, the goal is to take your holdings from a publisher and essentially create a custom KBART file for just one library's holdings. And so sometimes that, you know, that's not really needed. If you buy something like JSTOR Arts and Sciences 1, that package is always the same for everyone across the board. But sometimes, you know, you might say subscribe to 100 Elsevier titles that you just picked 100 of the titles that were most relevant to you, and that doesn't match any given package. So you actually have to go into your knowledge base and kind of check off all those boxes. And then if something changes, you have to go in and update it. And essentially what this does is provides an API that lets the content provider tell your knowledge base vendor, this is exactly what this library has access to, and then your knowledge base vendor just updates that for you. And it pretty much happens in real time. As soon as something updates on the publisher's end, it just gets pushed into your knowledge base. And so the recommended practice for this is still a draft, but a number of vendors are already providing this service and making announcements about it. So I think it's something that people are pretty excited about. And I think also, you know, once this is out there, it may also open up other opportunities for people to use those APIs as well. So now I'll talk a little bit about KBART in practice and some of the uses and projects that I'm aware of that show how libraries are using KBART data and knowledge-based data in their workflows. So I guess to start this off, I mean, I sort of do want to pose the question of why does KBART matter to librarians? Because, you know, in some ways, the standard is really aimed at content providers and knowledge-based vendors, and they're the ones doing a lot of the work of creating the files and harvesting the files these days. But I mean, I would argue that KBART does matter because good metadata benefits everyone. And, you know, you don't want your users getting screens like this that are asking them to pay for things that are crazily expensive. So I think, you know, there's an advocacy role that librarians have with relation to almost every standard and recommended practice, where it's really on us to make it known to publishers and content providers that we want to see KBART used, we want to see it adopted, we want to see these files made available. And so that's kind of like the basic level thing that people can do as it comes up. But I do think that there are some other uses for KBART and knowledge-based data that are showing librarians kind of getting their hands in this data a little bit more. So the first example I'm going to talk about comes from NC State Libraries in my former department where I worked working in the serials group. And one of the things that we had been working on at NC State, and this actually predated me even, I think going back to like the early 2000s, we had a tool called eMatrix that's still in use that is a locally developed e-resources management system. And the way that eMatrix worked is that it actually every night it harvested all the metadata from our vended knowledge base. So we kind of had an agreement with the vendor that we were allowed to do this. It would pull that in. It also pulled in some data from our ILS, and it created a record for all the titles in our knowledge base. And then it let us do additional things with that data. And one of the things that we did was a process that we called access verification. And the goal of this process was actually to sort of, you know, almost like serials check-in for e-resources, but on a more occasional basis. So it basically let us take up a knowledge base package directly from our knowledge base and kind of load it into this interface where we then had a button, and you would sort of go into this verification process where you'd get a link, you could go out, check the site to make sure that you actually had access, that it matched up with the coverage dates that were in the knowledge base, that the URL was correct. And you could either say that everything was fine, or if it was wrong, you could record what you thought the problem was, and it would actually send like a troubleshooting ticket to our serials department so that they could look into the problem and try to fix it. And so in a way, we were actually kind of verifying that these KBART title lists that publishers were providing to knowledge bases were correct. And I mean, that's a ton of work. We obviously couldn't do that for every package all the time, but we did it a lot when either, you know, we had done a big cancellation project and we knew there were going to be a lot of changes. If we like radically altered the terms of a particular subscription, or even if there just was a publisher that we felt like was having a lot of trouble, we could queue up a list for verification and then give that to like a student worker to do a first pass, and then someone from the library could go through and address the problems. So that's one particular workflow that happened to work for us, but what I like about it is the way that it shows how we sort of said, you know, this KBART data is really useful and we could use this for something else that is more of a management tool rather than discovery. And so we kind of figured out a way to do that. So I think just keeping in mind that data is there and it can be used to help solve problems is a really good thing. Oops. I'll talk now a little bit about folio and e-resources management, because I kind of see folio as being like the next step in the evolution of how people are using knowledge-based data for e-resources management. And so Folio, as an open source project, one of the goals of the project has been to try to be really flexible and offer people a lot of options for the way that they can do things. And so we're in the process of building an e-resources management tool for Folio. And one of the goals of that tool has always been integration with knowledge bases. And so this kind of comes out of the idea that almost every library, and particularly every large academic library, probably manages a knowledge base already. And the last thing that anyone wants to do is manage another knowledge base. And a lot of times an ERM system can kind of become almost like a second knowledge base. So we've said, instead of doing that, let's take that data that we're already managing in a particular knowledge base and let's see if we can pull that into Folio and then let people use that as the basis for their e-resource management tool. And so we've done this so far with two different knowledge bases. One is the EBSCO knowledge base, and that's kind of a natural fit because EBSCO is one of the partners on Folio, so they've been really accommodating in helping support that. And then the other one is GoKB, the Global Open Knowledge Base, because that's an open source project as well. It's been easy to use their data and create that linkage. And so basically the way this works is that you can see in this agreement screen here, you're actually able to search the contents of a knowledge base within Folio. So I could pull up all these JSTOR packages, and then with what I can do is add those packages to an agreement, which basically represents like my local version of that package that I've negotiated with the vendor. And then for that agreement, I can add things like license information, business terms, organizations, working on finances, so being able to actually link up to the acquisition system and put in a cost for either the package or the titles in the package. But all that knowledge-based data is knowledge-based data that lives somewhere else. It's just being used within the Folio system. And so I think that's the brilliant part of it, is that it means you don't have to manage that data again. And so we're still trying to figure out how we can work with even more knowledge-based vendors on this. We would love to see some of the other commercial products out there who might be willing to work on an integration with Folio. And it also means that, you know, for people who adopt Folio, you don't necessarily then have to change your knowledge base and all your discovery tools, which is really nice as well. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about the Global Open Knowledge Base. And this is kind of the other thing that I see happening, which is that there are particular libraries and groups out there that are actually saying, you know, we might really want to inhabit that role in the supply chain as a creator of KBART files and not just rely on the files that we get from our vendors. And so the Global Open Knowledge Base originally was kind of the idea that librarians would collaboratively help build a knowledge base of open data that could be used with projects like Folio or any other project. And then there had been a lot of sort of changes in direction, and the project has come under new leadership. It's actually being led by a group in Germany, a consortium called GBV, and they have a very specific goal in the short term, which is that because they operate in such a heavily consortial environment, they actually want to have their own knowledge base of all the consortial packages that they negotiate within their group. And so they see GoKB as a place where they can create all these KBART files for their negotiated packages and put them in GoKB, make them available to Folio, make them available to other services that they control. And so this screen here just kind of shows up their little upload tool that they've been working on. And you can see here, this is a KBART file. It's using the naming convention, and they can specify that it's KBART, and that's really nice because it means that it's a standard format. It's very easy to ingest, and so they've been gradually building up their KBART files for these German consortial packages. And GoKB is still open, so I think if there were other groups out there that wanted to do something similar or had a similar need for a knowledge-based tool that was open, there would be opportunities to use GoKB in a different way as well. So I think, you know, it's an idea that is really great in some ways. I think in its original iteration, we saw the challenges of just how much work it is to create all these KBART files. And I know for me personally, it really helped me appreciate the work that content providers have to put into this. And so I think we're still sort of figuring out, like, how can this work for libraries to be the ones creating these types of knowledge bases and knowledge base data. But I do think that there are potential there, and I hope that you know, seeing GoKB and Folio come together will provide some inspiration for people about exactly what that might look like and some of the opportunities that exist around using KBART in a different way. So that's it for the KBART portion of my slides. So I think at this point I can pause and take any questions if any have come up.
All right, we have had a couple come up. And the first one refers to when we were talking about the KBART ecosystem. And we have a question, if you could perhaps provide some examples of what you mean by content. And are you referring to serials or articles that come in the serials package?
Yeah, that's actually is a great question. So within the context of KBART, I am referring to serials, so e-journals and also e-books, because KBART covers both of those now. But particularly within the context of serials, KBART has always operated at the issue level is kind of like the finest grain detail. So if you have a KBART file, say that's describing JSTOR Arts and Sciences 1, for any particular title in that package, the most detailed information that you're going to get is that, like, you know, Journal AA is part of this package, starting with Volume 1, Issue 1, and going through Volume 10, Issue 10, that's maybe, you know, published in 1950. So that's kind of like the most detailed information you can get from a KBART file right now. And so that clearly doesn't include article level metadata. I do actually think that article level metadata is kind of like the next frontier, maybe, for knowledge bases or for the types of tools that libraries are working with. Right now, I think we're seeing that mostly in the tools like EDS and Summon and Primo and WorldCat Local, where those vendors have started to actually create agreements with publishers to harvest article level full text metadata and make that all searchable. I think one of the things that's challenging about that situation is that all that metadata is very locked down. So we can see kind of the search results based on it, but we don't actually have access to it in the way that we have access to these KBART files. And so I think there's a lot of library projects that could benefit from having article level metadata available. I just haven't seen anything happen yet that's really focused on trying to make that metadata more widely available.
Great, thank you. And the next question is about licensing. Does licensing play a role in the KBART process? And if so, where does it come in?
I mean, in terms of KBART itself, from a pure, you know, purely looking at the recommended practice, not really. I would say licensing is kind of a separate thing. I think just going back to the slide, there can be an intersection there if you are using an ERM. So, you know, I mean, intellectually, there's a connection, because you could say, well, I have JSTOR Arts and Sciences 2. That's a package in a knowledge base that exists as a KBART file somewhere. And presumably, as a library, I've purchased this, I have a license agreement somewhere that covers JSTOR Arts and Sciences 2. And the question is, like, how do I make the connection between those two things? And I think that's where something like an ERM or a library services platform, where ERM is kind of baked into your day-to-day library operations, is the place where you can make the connections between that data.
Okay, great, thanks. And the next two are somewhat related. And so one is, can you talk a little bit about any difference between KBART files and the serials content that appears in MARC records? And to that extent, what's the relationship between KBART and OCLC's collection manager?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say the difference between KBART and a MARC record is that KBART is more focused on a holding. And by that, I mean a KBART, like a line in a KBART file is telling you, I have, you know, journal X, it's part of the package JSTOR Arts and Sciences 2, it's provided by JSTOR, and I can access it at jstor.org/ blah, blah, blah. So it's this very specific version of a particular title, whereas a MARC record is describing that same title in more of a bibliographic context. So that title, maybe I'll just say Serials Review, since that gives us something concrete. You know, Serials Review is published right now by Taylor and Francis. I can access it on the Taylor and Francis website. It used to be published by Elsevier. They still have some content on their website. It's part of some EBSCOhost databases, so that content is on an EBSCOhost website. And so KBART is describing each one of those things separately, whereas a MARC record is just saying Serials Review. It's an intellectual concept of a journal called Serials Review, but it doesn't have anything to do with exactly how it's being provided. And so the question about the question about OCLC Collection Manager, I haven't used that tool myself, so I'm not sure that I can really answer that. But one thing I do know from talking with people at OCLC is that OCLC have their own knowledge base that they use with their discovery tools, and I know that they have actually done their knowledge base in such a way that each holding in the knowledge base is connected to the OCLC number. So you have that connection there, but because of that difference in the way that it's described, one OCLC number that describes a journal title might be associated with multiple holdings in a knowledge base or in a KBART file, because those are the different versions of that title that exist on different platforms.
Okay, great, thank you. So we do have time for one more question for the KBART section. So for those that we're not getting to, either we can revisit them at the end if we have time, or Kristen has offered to answer them in an email afterwards. So the last one we're going to talk about now is, how is open access represented in the KBART standard?
Yeah, let me go back to the slide. So these are the fields for KBART, and basically the only way that it's indicated right now is with this access type field, and that field can have two values, free and paid. And so if something is free, I mean, free is sort of maybe broader than open access in some ways. If it's free for any reason, it gets the code F. And that's probably something that could stand to be revisited. You know, it works well enough, but I think there are some challenges there, particularly, and this goes back to the article level metadata question. If you have a hybrid open access journal where some of the articles are open and some aren't, there's really no way to represent that in KBART. And so I think the general rule for KBART is that if it's not 100% open access, you have to mark it as paid. And so I think, you know, that's a known problem that I've seen a couple conference presentations about that and know that people are thinking about it, but I haven't really seen anything coming up yet in terms of like a formal solution.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think we can move on from the KBART portion now.
Okay. Okay, so transfer, I'm gonna kind of follow the same format and talk a little bit about the standard and then about some examples of how I have seen it being used. So transfer, like KBART, is a NISO code of practice, and basically transfer has been created to help with the scenario where a journal title or serial title that's owned by a particular publisher is sold to a different publisher. And so making sure that when that transition happens, that title remains accessible and that libraries know how to deal with that transfer and have the information they need. And also, like KBART, this started out as a UKSG initiative in 2006, and then it became a NISO recommended practice in 2015. So I'll talk a little bit about why transfer is needed. You know, I think probably if you're attending a webinar about serials, you're well aware of serial transfers across publishers is just kind of one of the facts of life of serials, that things are always getting bought and sold, moving from one platform to another, things about them are changing. And when that happens, as serials librarians, it raises a lot of questions, and a lot of details are needed to figure out how to best manage that transition from the library perspective, and to make sure from a patron perspective that it's handled as well. So some of the questions that might come up are, when is the transfer happening? And that's pretty basic and important. You know, of course, you want to know who the new publisher will be and how are you going to get access to that. So what's the new website, where the title lives? There's also a lot of questions that come up with serials, particularly if they're subscribed content that you have ownership of your back files. When a title transfers from one publisher to another, often, well, there's different ways that it can be handled. So in some cases, the older issues of the journal will actually continue to live on the old publisher's website, and the new publisher will just pick it up with the next issue. In other cases, it's kind of the reverse, where the old publisher will actually just go away entirely and everything will move to the new publisher. And then in other cases, you actually have a situation where both happen, where the old publisher keeps hosting the back files, but the new publisher gets them as well. And in that case, as a library, you'll often end up having some access on two different websites. And so that's all important to know, because you want to make sure, and this is a good tie-in to KBART, that your knowledge base, your discovery tools, your catalog, that everything gets updated with information about the new publisher, so that your users don't experience any interruption in access. There's also questions about perpetual access rights. You know, if you have been subscribing for a long time and you have ownership of all these back issues, you want to make sure that the new publisher is going to honor that, especially if the back files are moving to the new publisher. So it's useful to know about transfers that have all these details, so that you can verify that the things that are supposed to be happening are happening, and that your users aren't going to be inconvenienced if the title becomes inaccessible. So now I'll talk a little bit about the features of transfer and how they help support that mission. So the transfer code of practice basically lays out a series of information fields that should be published when a transfer occurs. And these are basically the information that's needed to help a library answer those questions that I just talked about. And so the things that transfer covers are, of course, the journal itself with its ISSNs. This one doesn't have DOI or society, but that could be in there. Frequency. So this is basically just telling you, like, this is the title, so that I know exactly what's being talked about. Then there's information about both the transferring publisher and the receiving publisher. So for both of those, you have the name and a contact person, as well as the URL for the title. So you can know this is where it was, this is where the new content is going to be living. And then transfer compliant. I mean, in this example, it's nice that both publishers are transfer compliant. I would assume if at least one of the publishers was compliant, then the transfer could end up in the transfer database. If neither publisher is compliant, that's kind of the worst case scenario, and things could fall through the cracks. So you do need at least one publisher who is participating in project transfer. Then there's some basic transfer details, basically about when the transfer is starting. Some may have special circumstances, and that could be something like if there's going to be a frequency change, or maybe like the numbering is going to restart or something weird like that. And then finally, it does address the perpetual access elements. Digital preservation, I guess, is a little broader. You know, that's kind of talking about if this is part of LOCKSS or Portico or something like that. And that basically addresses the case of, like, imagine that both of these publishers just totally went out of business and their entire web presence disappeared. Something like Portico would be able to step in and provide access to all the old issues because the publishers can no longer do so. And then perpetual access is a little bit more on the library side of things. Here, knowing that both publishers will keep the archive, and so as a library, if I have perpetual access, I can make sure that that access is staying active on both of those websites, and then just a date as well. And the way that project transfer works is that it's the responsibility of the publishers to actually submit the transfer. And for a long time, project transfer was hosted by a university in the UK, and it just recently moved over to being hosted by the International ISSN Center. So I'm not as familiar with exactly how this interface works, but I believe it's part of the ISSN portal tool. And if you're a publisher who has the appropriate credentials, you can actually log in and see the titles that you're the publisher of. And then if you know that the transfer is occurring, you can declare that this transfer is happening and then submit all the information that was on the previous slide. And then that gets pushed into a series of different tools that I'm about to talk about. And basically there's several different tools that are designed to kind of expose the transfers and make sure that they're available publicly so that people can find this information and use it. The first thing I'll talk about is the Transfer Alerting Service database. And this is basically just a big database of all the transfers that have been reported. And you can browse or search this database. So you can just kind of go in and see all the most recent things. You can do some filtering. You can do a search and search for a particular title. So this would be good in a situation where, you know, maybe you're having a problem with a particular title and you're asking yourself, is this a transfer? You could look it up in here and see what the details are. The Transfer Alerting Service also has an RSS feed, which a lot of people are familiar with, these types of feeds from various blogs and websites. But it's basically a feed that lets you pull the information from the Transfer Alerting Service into another platform. A lot of people use RSS readers, probably Feedly right now is the most popular one. So you could actually hook up this RSS feed to your Feedly account and you would get a notification every time a new transfer was recorded. A lot of tools like internet sites and blogs also let you embed RSS feeds into a page. So if you had like a staff intranet, you could actually embed the transfer RSS feed in there and have a place where people could go within your local environment to actually see kind of this list of transfers and at least the most recent things that had come through. And then this is new that Transfer has rolled out an API for the alerting service. And so that's an application programming interface. And basically what an API does is it allows a machine to kind of pull this information into another tool. So in some ways, it's not hugely different than the RSS reader. It's just a little bit more of a modern protocol for doing that a lot of systems are tending to use these days. And I'm not a programmer, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about actually implementing this. But I think, you know, if you have a developer at your library or someone who routinely does this kind of work, the type of API they're using would probably be familiar to them. So I'll conclude by talking a little bit about transfer in practice and really kind of one particular example that I've had experience with of working with project transfer. But before I do that, I mean, this is kind of the same like PSA type message as KBART to basically say that, you know, using transfer and being an advocate for it is a great first step for any standard. I think for the people who run it to be able to show that the service is being used is really important. And for, you know, to let publishers know if you see a publisher who's not handling transfers well, you can always say like, hey, did you know about project transfer? Maybe that's something that you should investigate being a part of. And so I think just being an advocate is something that we as libraries can always do, in addition to just the practical benefits of the transfer database. And it's a really nice, easy to use tool. And then the specific example that I'm going to talk about is a project that I worked on when I was at NC State Libraries to essentially try to build a transfers tool locally. And as a kind of caveat, I guess I wouldn't necessarily recommend that anyone try to reproduce this project exactly as described. It was kind of experimental and there were things that worked well about it or less well, but I think the idea behind it is really good. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that as kind of, if nothing else, just an inspiration for the kinds of things that you might be able to do with something like transfer. So basically what the goal of this tool was that it was to take the transfer feed, and so I believe at the time we were just using the RSS feed because the API didn't exist, and pull it into an Access database. And then at the same time, we were actually taking our knowledge base data from our vendor knowledge base and pulling it into the same database. So we are essentially taking all the transfers, which represent all the transfers in the world, and matching them up with our local holdings in an attempt to produce a feed of only transfers that actually apply to us. So being able to see the things that we had a subscription to, so we would know that this is a transfer we have to act on, as opposed to a lot of the ones that would come through where we didn't actually hold the title, so it didn't affect us. And this is just kind of shows, there's a lot of words here, but we had to do a good amount of data munging here, things like normalizing names. We used ISSN-L as kind of a disambiguator. And so we did a lot of work with that. And then the goal was that we could produce this work list of transfers that were applicable to us at the local level. And then the other part of this project was kind of almost like a workflow tool that was also built into this Access database. And the idea was that for each transfer that came through, as well as other types of work that were unrelated to project transfer, they could actually be assigned to a staff member in our unit. And then each person, in this case, Christina, could actually come in, open up her little desktop area and see all of the serial issues that have been assigned to her. And so in this example, you could see that the action is a transfer, and then the source, this was from the old UKSG database for project transfer. So you would see this and know, okay, this is a transfer that's coming in through project transfer. And we were able to pull in some of this information like ISSNs. Some of this came from our local data as well, like a purchase order number. But we were able to pull in things like the previous publisher and the new publisher, as well as some notes. And so this was basically a way for us to say like, hey, this is a transfer that we need to pay attention to. Let's look at project transfer. Let's make sure that we've updated our knowledge base. Let's make sure that if we have to, you know, switch vendors or do a new license agreement or any of the things that come along with a transfer, this would kind of either prompt us to do it or prompt us to make sure that we maybe had already done it, because sometimes things would come through in a batch or have different reasons why they had already been done. And so, you know, this was always kind of a pilot, and we used it for a little while. Then we ended up having to migrate this tool to a different system. And at the time that I had left NC State, we had not reestablished the transfer thing, but I know that they're still interested in doing that. And I think especially with the APIs and stuff, I mean, it's something I'd love to see a library or a vendor pick up and work with, or build some kind of feature into an ERM. I think there's really a lot that you could do with it. And so you know, that's just something to think about or keep in mind, or, you know, ask a vendor to do for you. And actually, if people do know of anybody who is using the transfer API, I'd be curious to know about that too, because I wasn't really able to find any specific examples of how that's being used yet. So, you know, you can always email me or share a comment or something if you know of anything interesting that's happening there. But that's it for the transfer section. So we have a few more minutes for questions as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kristen. So as you said, we have just a few minutes for questions. If you do have questions about transfer and have not yet typed them into the question box, please go ahead and do so now. And we have one sitting here still about KBART. I hope it's okay that we go ahead and address this one.
That's fine.
So is there anything that can be done regarding publishers and vendors naming collections differently in their admin sites versus what the collections are named in the knowledge base? Sometimes there's a lot of hunting and guessing to make sure you're selecting the right one.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a known problem. And I mean, I think it comes from the fact that the content provider probably has one KBART file that's named something, but that name isn't very user-friendly. And so each knowledge base vendor gives it a slightly different name, and it's hard to tell that it's actually the same thing across different knowledge bases. Back when I was working on the global open knowledge base project, we actually had some dreams of like creating like a package identifier that, vendors could adopt and be able to say, well, EBSCO Academic Search Premier has this identifier and like all the vendors could use it. And we didn't, that's a pretty challenging thing to implement, but I still think it's a great idea. But yeah, I mean, right now that is definitely just a known issue.
All right, thank you. And we still haven't gotten any questions about transfer, but we do have time for one more question, and there's one left from KBART. And
Okay.
it is, what is the difference between OpenURL and the URL that appears in the 856 field of the marked serials record?
Right. I wish actually I had put in these slides an example of an OpenURL and what it looks like, but an OpenURL is kind of like a special URL that's meant for another system to decode. So like you would never put an open URL like on a web page or somewhere where a patron was going to see it. It's really long and it will say like title equals serials review, author equals Wilson. It'll have all the different fields listed in it. And then basically when the link resolver gets that open URL sent to it, it can read all those fields and know what metadata is needed. Whereas in the 856, usually, since you're usually dealing with a journal title, the 856 is usually a link to like the title page or the table of contents of a whole journal. So it's not going to get you to an individual article, and the 856 is also not really machine readable by a link resolver tool. It's more of a human URL that's just designed to sort of get you somewhere where then you can navigate to where you want to go. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's helpful. So yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for the presentation, Kristen. Today it's been a really great session. And thank you everyone else who was able to join us. All the attendees will soon receive a short online evaluation form. So if you could please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and do help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. You also now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. And thank you again to our presenter, Kristen Wilson. Thank you also to members of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, Catherine Balick, Wanda Jazzieri, and Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS does have other continuing education events coming up. We have 4 more webinar events this season, including part 2 of Standardizing Serials. The next webinar will be Wednesday, May 22nd, covering a shared approach to BibFrame implementation. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on May 21st, covering changing ideas, roles, and organizational structures in collection and technical services. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. And once again, thank you all for joining us today, and this will conclude our session.